Everyone, we've been taking a look at the Baroque in Holland, and I wanted to examine one last artist coming from the area. He's a contemporary of Rembrandt, I wanted to show you his style as he fits into this larger cultural discussion. Vermeer, we don't really know much about his life. We know that he was born in Delft, which is in modern day the Netherlands, in around 1632, and marries Catharina Bolnes in 1653. He may have studied at Amsterdam. He may have studied at Utrecht. We don't really know. We know that she was Catholic and he probably converted prior to their marriage, which means, right, that complexity means that he's a Catholic living in a predominantly Calvinist part of the country. And so that's going to put some tensions on them culturally speaking, being out of place in some of the larger religious conflicts that are going on in the Dutch-speaking world at the time. He moved in with her mother and spent the rest of his life painting in the same town, in the same house, in the same room. And so there's going to be a kind of a common theme, a kind of common idea that we see within his works. They're going to be mainly interiors. There's going to be light coming in from the window, right? These are going to be common elements of a Vermeer painting. He produced about 1 or 2 works per year, which really isn't a lot for artists, right? They're generally producing much more than that, but he was very meticulous in his design, very meticulous in his detail, which is common to other earlier works of art that we studied, such as Jan van Eyck, right? He is very meticulous in terms of detail, and Vermeer carries that tradition over, but he's also borrowing the ideas from Italy in terms of borrowing Caravaggio's style in his light play. He had 15 children in this one kind of tiny room in the Netherlands. 11 of them survived mortality. Infant mortality was much higher back then. But it was with him, his mother-in-law, and his 11 children and his wife. It was a very cramped, close quarters place. Probably a lot of chaos that was happening in their household. Right, 5 other adults lived in the house besides the family. But yet, what's interesting about that is he never shows the chaos of the home, of family life. Every painting that he paints is very orderly. So it is kind of a juxtaposition. Maybe this was kind of his escape from the chaos of what was happening at home. Maybe it was just a representation of kind of this idea of what family life should be. It should be very structured and very civil and stoic in that sense. But Vermeer's Baroque style runs contrary to other Baroque artists. It's not about big sweeping movements. Mainly it's about gentleness and quiet simplicity, as we see here with the officer and the laughing girl, right? There's not a big sweeping motion that we would see with Bernini and his Apollo and Daphne representation, or his David representation of David in motion, right? We don't really see that. It's very quiet. It's very simple. It's just these two individuals in kind of this intimate space just conversing with one another, right? Mainly it's about capturing the stark realities of everyday life. He brings us into the drama of daily events, and it makes them transcendent, makes them more than just ordinary occurrences. It makes them more significant, more important, right? As the light falls gently on the laughing girl's face, it seems as though she has this quiet radiance. Kind of a similar idea that we see with other representations of Mary or other religious figures, right? But here she's not a religious figure. She's just someone that's sitting in the light, but her face has that same kind of glow, right? The same kind of radiance within it. Similar to what we've seen with Bruegel's Hunters in the Snow, we see scenes of what people are doing and what they value, right? This is a study similar to the ideas of Calvinism. We see some ideas of Calvinism, even though his wife was a Catholic. He's surrounded by Calvinist ideas. And so we see them embedded within his work, and mainly they're going to be the ones that are buying his work. And so he's going to be familiar with the ideas and representing them within his art. We're going to see within his works themes that suggest work is next to godliness, right? That we must be industrious, we must be thrifty. His works show mainly interiors of middle class life, this rising merchant class that we see with a gaining wealth and notoriety of the Dutch-speaking world. We see that kind of emphasis of the merchant class coming to be, right? And these are going to be the ones that are paying for his art. So he's representing the people who are paying for his art and what they value. Some people wonder if he used mechanical instruments to capture his realistic images, but other people suggest that he uses a camera obscura. And I just wanted to show you just a clip of what this perhaps would look like, right? So this is just the technique of camera obscura. Mainly what it is, camera obscura just means, camera means dark, and obscura in Italian means, camera means room, and obscura means dark. And so it just means a darkened room. And so they're going to darken the room from all the light. They're going to put a small hole in the window. And the images outside are going to project inside, only they'll be upside down. So this is an ancient technique that, Romans and Greeks would know.
Room,
there's the image upside down.
Size that has an opening looking out into the world. Through that opening, an upside down image of the outside actually gets projected on the back of that room. It's a very simple physical process.
So you can do this in your apartments over the weekend. Try it out. But artists would use this technique. It was known that many artists would use this technique in order to capture realism. They would just, trace over the image, and then of course they would flip it back over to reveal their works, right? But it's a technique that some suggest that he most likely used. But notice how he fits into this larger cultural discussion that we've been taking a look at. On the right-hand side, you see Honthorst and his Procuress, where a young gentleman comes in this kind of seedy, place, establishment, and an old woman directs him to this young lady who is well lit, and she's, associated with music and dance and all of this kind of triviality of the world, the vices of the world, and he kind of gets kind of lured into that. We see a similar representation here with the laughing girl. We see a gentleman and we see a woman in the light, right? So he's familiar with that tradition, right? He removes the old lady, the procuress, from the particular image here. He removes the financial exchange, the young man clutching the purse that we see in Honthorst on the bottom right. But we do see the woman holding a wine glass, which would associate this as some type of, losing sobriety and that kind of exchange. But he also kind of opens it up. It's much more unclear. It's much more ambiguous in Vermeer's work. He's not necessarily as heavy-handed as Honthorst or some of Honthorst's contemporaries. This one is just about, it could be that these people are neighbors. It could be that they're just friends. It could be that they're siblings. We don't really know, right? We don't really know what's really their exchange. Maybe people of the day would have thought, okay, this is similar to Honthorst. This is moralizing this particular incident. It's showing the power of women and their ability to lure men to their demise. Maybe, but I think he softens that commentary, right? It's not as overt. It's not as heavy-handed as we see with Honthorst. It could just be a simple exchange between two people, and it's perhaps modeling how people can interact without having these larger, sins and other problems. I love the representation or the use of the map in the background, which is also culturally significant for Holland at the time as they're going throughout the world. To dominate the world in terms of their navy and their shipping, bringing these supplies back, and it shows their wide reach. It shows their interest in navigation. So these are all key contextual elements that puts it within the era. But what we see here is his kind of connection to that larger kind of movement, right? That kind of larger discussion happening between that encounter between a man and woman. And we've seen it a little bit. I mean, I think he's more in line of being influenced by Leicester than he would be by Honthorst, even though we do see some connections with Honthorst and the Procurus. Leicester's The Proposition shows just a woman going about her work, and then the man comes in with the money in his right hand, trying to pull her shoulder away, trying to distract her away from her work. And I think Leicester captures the essence of what happens in a very male-dominated society where men own the property. Men are the ones that are able to work and have independence and have a political voice. In a very patriarchal society, it's mainly going to be the men that lure the women away rather than the other way around, right? Which is kind of different from what we see with Honthorst and other representations of the femme fatale, or the fatal woman leading men to their demise. I think Vermeer is much more in line with that, right? This person here, very elaborately dressed, coming in, and she's much more portrayed as innocent, even though she is holding a glass here. We see a similar element to this one. This one's much more closely aligned with other themes that we see with Leicester in The Proposition or Honthorst and Procurus. This is the girl with a wine glass, right? So again, we see this kind of wine associated with women, and then she kind of turns to the viewer and kind of smiles. Very similar to what we see with Caravaggio and the Bacchus, where he's inviting us in, and so she's kind of engaging with the viewer. And the man is much more suggestive. This one is much more innocent, and in terms of this kind of encounter, this exchange, he takes her hand, kisses her hand, and so this is much more of a overt proposition. The fruit on the table could represent a number of things. It could represent vitality. It could represent fertility. It could represent sin in terms of the Garden of Eden and the fall. It could represent the memento mori, right? The remember that tomorrow we could die, right? That life is temporary. And so in a sense, even though it's not overtly religious, it still has that moralizing quality that other works of the day have. But what we see with his representations is his representations of women are very different from other contemporaries. We see women that are just going about their labors, right? Just kind of going about their day and day-to-day life, which is going to be different from others that we've seen. With Franz Holland, the Gypsy Girl, there's almost a fear of womanhood. Women possess this kind of allure that can be dangerous for both men and women. But I don't think Vermeer shares that same concern or that same view. With the milkmaid, she's just going about her day. We see the light coming in, which is going to be key for Vermeer works. They're going to have the light coming in, shining on the face as she's going about her work. But she's not really doing anything necessarily, problematic. It's actually celebrating the Calvinist idea of hard work, industry keeps you out of trouble, right? And so she's going here, pouring the milk that she just acquired. She's probably not actually the milkmaid. She doesn't really have the same tan lines that someone working outside would generally have. She's probably an indoor worker, an indoor servant, not part of that upper middle class. This is part of the working class, and so she's much more sturdy, showing her kind of labor. But she's now preparing probably some type of bread pudding or some type of dessert that she's going to make with the stale leftover bread. But she's going about her day industrious, not necessarily leading people to their destruction. What's key for Vermeer's work is he only did one or two of them a year. There's only he only made 60 of them in his life, and only 30-some of them remain. And so they're very rare to get their hands on. Here we see a similar idea of this. Is just a woman sitting at a desk writing a letter, and her maid comes in, right? So this idea of the rising merchant class now has the ability to afford maids and people to assist them that only the aristocracy, the kings, queens, the dukes, the duchesses would have had in another type of society. But we have the rising wealth of the merchant class in Holland and Flanders that is enabling the rising middle class to be able to have servants. And so we see that connection between the upper middle class and then the servant class, and that kind of connection. And And Vermeer represents them, both of them kind of intimately, both of them not necessarily displaying a class distinction per se, that he's looking down on one class or looking, up at another class. He's mainly just representing them about their daily events. And so here the maid comes in and gives the mistress a letter. Now, the letter could be this letter from some liaison or boyfriend or something kind of illicit, something more scandalous, but it could just be a letter from a family member, right? We don't necessarily know. And what makes Vermeer's engaging is the mystery, is the mystique behind them, right? This is one of his more famous ones. This one is in the Louvre and gets a lot of attention, but it demonstrates a similar idea that we see with the Milkmaid, where we see the light coming in, right? So we don't necessarily see the window in this one, but lighting is key for Vermeer. He doesn't necessarily show the heavy tenebrism that we would see with Honthorst or with Rembrandt. Kind of softens the lighting, but we still see that lighting is key. That is common of the Baroque era. But what we see, the focus here is on women at work, women doing what women do, not necessarily just going out to lead men to their destruction, but they actually have responsibilities. They actually have interests. And he's kind of inviting us into that intimate space to kind of think about perhaps women differently, perhaps thinking about the value of women differently, representing them as they are rather than representing them in some type of narrowly confined stereotype, right? So he's kind of expanding that. But yes, it's still limited in terms of what women are doing, right? Milkmaids or lace making is still kind of limited in terms of the role of women. But he's trying to change the idea that women just aren't out to destroy, that they have this kind of value. This one is just my wife standing next to it in the Louvre to give you the sense of how tiny some of these images really can be, and the fine brushwork that the artists have to use in order to get these finer details. This one is perhaps the most popular of Vermeer's, The Girl with a Pearl Earring, which was kind of an interesting representation. It has that kind of mysterious quality that's common to many of the Vermeers. But this one's a little bit different from other Vermeers in terms of it's much more closer, it's much more intimate. We don't necessarily see other spaces, or we don't see a map, we don't see the window, right? We do see that there's a window, a source of lighting coming in from the left, casting the darker shadows towards the right. But we don't necessarily see it, and everything is darkened around it. So it kind of has that tenebrism that we would generally see with Vermeer. But here he's representing the girl with a pearl earring, like this rising middle class, demonstrating the pearl, which is much too big for an actual pearl, right? That thing would have to be the size of like a tangerine or something if it was to be real. It's most likely a piece of glass. It's probably some type of costume costume jewelry that he just had her wear. But it demonstrates, right, the importance of this rising, merchant class, and showing the turban shows that kind of influence throughout the rest of the world as the Netherlands are going out. But there's some ambiguity, right? Is she turning away from the viewer? She's clearly engaging the viewer, but is she turning away or is she turning towards, right? Her eye provides that contact that engages us into the work. And her lips are slightly parted to make it look like she's about to say something. And then the question is, what is she going to say, right? And so again, it's that kind of idea of how does this fit with a larger cultural discussion? Is she like Judith, or is she just a kind of a common average person, right? Is this a kind of a moralizing tale of, Holofernes and getting drunk and then letting his guard down? Is this a moralizing tale of the prodigal son? Or is this just a representation of someone that's going about their day-to-day life, right? And that's part of the intrigue, right? He's aware of these larger, discussions that are happening around him. He's been familiar with these ideas that are circulating around the art world, but he's also trying to deviate from them. And so something to think about, right, is how do you think this fits or deviates from other representations of women that we've seen? What does Vermeer add to this ongoing discussion? This is my wife and I. This is at the Maurits House in The Hague in the Netherlands. We made a pilgrimage to see this specific work there. My wife was extremely excited. This is one of her favorite works of art. But again, it shows you the size, right? So sometimes these large images that we study in art history, we think of them as they're going to be extremely large, but it turns out a lot of them are very tiny. But yet, even though they're small in size, they are large in their cultural impact and they're large in their cultural significance, right? So again, getting back to that ambiguity, and this is where I would like you to kind of think about, right? Is what do you think the message of the work is, right? Is she's kind of turning towards us, turning away from us? She seems like she has something to say. Why is there so much attention to her eyes, right? Kind of there on that rule of thirds, that line, kind of engaging us, directing our attention to it. Why do you think the turban is there and the exaggerated pearl, right? Is that just a demonstration of cultural influence and affluence of the Netherlands, right? How might this fit with other works of the era, and how is it kind of somewhat different? And this was the last one I want to take a look at with Vermeer. Similar to other Vermeers that we have seen, right? The idea of the window, a small room, a small space, which we can only imagine Vermeer probably felt with so many people occupying his house. And so we see this kind of intimate space that draws us in. And this is the astronomer, someone that's looking at the stars, that's calculating the movements of the heavens. And so in some ways, this is a focus on science, a focus on education, which is becoming more prominent as schools are starting to develop in the area at the time. But in some ways, this is also a study of kind of a quasi-religious kind of thing, because when you're studying the heavens, you're studying the movement of the stars, you're studying how things are organized, you're studying the ideas of how God created things. And so in a sense, the astronomer becomes kind of it's a secular image, yes, but it also is this idea that we should be studying these larger things, right? Yes, it's important to understand this very small specifics that we would see with a lace maker or a milkmaid. Those are important to focus on the daily events. But we also have to see the forest through the trees and see the larger scale of things and how we fit into the overall scheme of the universe and how this all fits in with theology. And so we see that these are the important ideas, influenced by Calvinism, influenced by the larger ideas of the Baroque era of his contemporaries and predecessors that came before him. And he's bringing these ideas in and merging them in with his own unique and very engaging, interactive, mysterious, captivating style.